So our first panel this afternoon is called Image, Sound, and Affect. And we're keeping with the order of the presenters. So our first presenter is Kareem El Damanhoury from Georgia State University. And the title of his talk is The Social Media Battle for Mosul, Visual Framing Analysis of Daesh's Imagery in Nineveh Province.
So I actually tweaked the title a little bit. That's the same topic. So my name is Kareem. I'm a PhD candidate at Georgia State University. Let me just jump into it because I have a lot to cover today. So starting with the notion of media systems. Media systems have been studied comparatively over the past half century, ranging from the four theories of the press in the post-Cold War era, going to Helena Mancini's typology of media systems in Western Europe, using four dimensions in that typology in particular. However, when those dimensions were used in non-Western context, it was found that non-Western media systems do not really fall under one or the other. It's usually a mix. But those are basically have been studied in nation states, basically. Some attempts by Crady was about transnational media systems, taking Saudi Arabia and Lebanon as a case. But what about unrecognized self-declared states? So Daesh has been pretty much the most enduring self-declared state in the past couple of years in the context of militant groups, officially from 2006 with the establishment of ISI. Media ops ever since has been a cornerstone of their operations. Promoting media jihad, what they call as media jihad, having centralized and localized media. So in the structure of the caliphate here in 2006, they basically lay a structure of their media operations using provincial media offices at the periphery and central media offices in the middle. So what about the visual component? In that essence, visual component has been the most prevalent type of propaganda or media type in Daesh's media operations over the past few years, and specifically still imagery has been the most prevalent one so far in terms of frequency. Disseminating photo reports and daily news briefs on Telegram channels since late 2015. Introducing actually a new template of photography dissemination comparatively to other groups, thanks to Telegram in that sense. So the power of images in the visual communication literature, images have been found to have proximity to the truth, in a sense, or argued to have proximity to the truth, to prove and authenticate, and in the case of groups like Daesh, be projectilic, as Marwan mentioned earlier. Visual frames have been argued to be less obtrusive than text, more memorable, more attention-grabbing, and also digging deeper into the level of visual semiotics, you find that subjective camera shots like the video game sort of thing, GTA and Call of Duty, immerse the viewer in the action. You see the differentiation between long shots versus close and medium shots in terms of personifying vis-a-vis typifying the scene in a sense, and also the camera angles in terms of symbolic power, high versus low. ISIS media campaign has been studied mainly under two research prongs. The broader campaign, pinpointing the decline in the output of Daesh amidst military pressure, pinpointing some shifts in the frames from utopia during the heydays to military, under military pressure, but not in-depth focus on photography though. More studies are now focusing on photography in particular, and in that sense they also highlight visual frames of the output. They highlight the visual semiotics to some extent, and also they highlight visual tropes like Barbie Zilitzer's About to Die, for example. But let's focus on the provincial level. So in that, here in the research questions in this paper is basically pinpointing at Nineveh province, which houses Mosul, looking both at the visual frames and the visual semiotics. But why Mosul? Apparently, the Iraqi de facto capital for Daesh for a long time. about 3 years, and they were operating before that as well. Intense military pressure starting from October 17th, 2016, for 4 months until they lost, towards the late January, they lost Mosul, and that escalated later on to losing Western Mosul, losing Iraq eventually, according to Abbadi, in December 2017. So really that gives us a unique opportunity to take a closer look at that media system, the proto-state media system of Daesh, in a very key transitional period. The methodology was basically a mixed methods approach, content analysis of all the data set of images disseminated on Nasher Telegram group during that period, which is about 1,200 images, visual framing and content analysis. So in terms of frequency, even when Daesh was losing in January, losing East Mosul, they had about 7 images per day on average. That fluctuated like November and December to reaching 14, but however, they were still persistent in the media realm. The frames were broken down into 2 main categories, military and non-military, with military being very prevalent at that transitional point in time. Military, digging deeper into it, was broken down. If we're gonna break it down chronologically, it's gonna be preparation, combat, war spoils, eulogies. I'm going to highlight some of those frames like combat. So that basically highlights ISIS militants in the field, fighting. If they're going to portray the enemies, which is here the Iraqi forces and the Peshmerga, they're almost always losing or escaping, as you can see at the top right, or destroyed in terms of tanks and weaponry. Those, it makes sense, it declined. So it declined by January, however, still an average of 2 combat images per day when they were actually about to lose East Mosul in its entirety. Visual icons that were prevalent, like the religious symbol, the monotheism gesture pointing to heaven. Militants almost always alone or in small groups against armies. You see the camera angles and how they were used, using the low angle shots to make the militants look very grandiose, vis-a-vis high angle shots when you're highlighting or displaying the corpses of Iraqi forces and Peshmerga. You see the subjective shots, almost 50% of all the subjective shots, the GTA sort of thing, Call of Duty style, were used in the combat images, immersing the viewer as with the militant as he is sniping, as he is fighting, as he's stepping on the corpses of the enemies here. With the war spoils, which is pretty much the only result, is loss for Daesh enemies. So you see here the weaponry, the artillery, the belongings, the IDs, and those also declined over time. And you see the visual icons in that sense that they would use Iraqi and Peshmerga flags only as an identifier of the losing side in that sense, and militants also mostly alone or in small groups. Using camera angle as well to look down on the belongings of there, and sometimes even highlighting the images of those who were allegedly killed, whether from the Iraqi forces or the Peshmerga. And subjective shots were used to a lesser extent, also immersing the viewer as they are holding the belongings or holding the weaponry of the losing side in that sense. Eulogy, one of the most interesting visual frames in here, displaying the ISIS martyrdom squad, if we can call them that. A very diverse pool of martyrs from Central Asia, from Africa, from the Arab world, you name it. Almost always being accompanied by either a text superimposed to highlight the martyr's caravan, or an istishhadi, which means like sort of a martyr, a derivative from the word martyr. And that actually, unlike the other frames, increased dramatically as the group was losing. So you see 119 images, 50 of them in January when they are actually losing East Mosul. You see the ISIS flag to some extent, but higher than all the other frames, being used as sort of an ideological, symbolical background at some point, using the monotheism gesture as a religious symbol as well, and militants almost always alone in that sense. Maintaining eye contact with the viewer to establish connection most of the time, maintaining a confident smile on their faces, as you know that they went out there and they blew themselves up. So basically highlighting the happiness involved in the notion of blowing yourself up for the cause of Allah in that context. Non-military frames, shifting gears to that, so I'm going to highlight some of them, like economy, which Lena touched on a little bit. So highlighting the normalcy in Mosul as they are losing. So even though the battles are going on and you're reading about it in the international media, we have economy that is booming. We have Mosul is flourishing, with the photo captions performing like an anchorage function using Ronald Barth's terminology to highlight agriculture, to highlight manufacturing, to highlight different types of economy. In essence, that was pretty constant with the exception of December. About 1 image per day, even when they are losing economy, is still there. Almost always putting it at typifying the scene as different types. Social services, the same thing, healthcare, education, Quran workshops, road construction, all that being there, and it declined a little bit. And also subjective shots used to some extent in social services where you identify either with the person receiving the benefit or the person providing the benefit in sense of healthcare or education in a school or zakat distribution. City and natural landscape. Again, international media talking about ISIS losing, but we're focusing giving some credit to the beauty of Mosul in terms of sunrise, sunset, and how it looks, and that was pretty constant with the exception of the last 10 days in October. Law enforcement, which is the last one I'm going to be highlighting today. Talking about the Sharia enforcement, photo captions pinpointing and highlighting that notion and stressing on that we are implementing Sharia in the lands of Daesh despite the odds, and highlighting what are the outlawed sins, whether it's cigarettes, whether it's adultery, whether it's stealing, you name it. It increased, even though the pool was a little bit small. We're talking about only 32 images here, but they increased a little bit in January when they were losing. Using also subjective shots to a lesser extent and close distance to the person, either here reading the verdict of a person of a homosexual man who's going to be thrown from the roof of a building, or being closer to the person who's being punished. And subjective shots used to a lesser extent and by means of OTSs, over-the-shoulder shots, where you're basically seeing the lashing of a robber or destroying alcohol. So in conclusion, we're talking about a proto-state media system here that defies the traditional dimensions of comparative media systems that have been out there for decades. And in that sense, the military pressure does not hinder the production and dissemination, and we can all see that now after losing ground. And it hinders some visual frames, as I mentioned before, but it doesn't stop them. In fact, some of the visual frames actually increase and surge as they are under pressure, like we mentioned with eulogy and like we mentioned with law enforcement, and some of them are constant, even despite the military pressure. But what about victimhood? Victimhood, people who are following Daesh and their products for some time, victimhood has always been a very prevalent narrative in their visual propaganda, especially on Syria. But here, in the case of Nashr, in case of 1,200 images, we see an intentional avoidance of victimhood, unlike other settings. In that sense, maybe that could be in part because of the eulogy, the surge of the eulogy, and in that sense, you're basically transforming death into an heroic act that is inflicting pain and punishment on the enemies and bringing happiness to the martyrs of the caliphate in that sense, which is also consistent with ISIS's rhetoric about Mosul in particular. So we see how in the Naba, the Arabic newsletter, they mention all the time, they invoke the notion that Mosul battle was an epic battle. In fact, going as far as saying that Mosul battle was one of the most important battles in the history of Islam over 1,400 years. Also, visual semiotics, we've seen how it's being used to immerse the viewer, to bring connection with the suicide squad, with getting closer to them. And in that sense, if we're talking about countering a proto-state media system, we're not talking about a counter-messaging campaign or two. We're talking about a nuanced, sustainable, creative option that needs to be invoked even if they lost land, that has to be out there. Counter-messaging campaigns have to be tapping into meta-narratives, as Yara was talking earlier about Noah's Ark and Others are talking about particular stuff that are very common to the ear of the target audience. So how can you get to them using something that taps into meta narratives and using alternative narratives in that sense, and also the use of visual semiotics. Visual semiotics are used, there is a pattern of their use which basically suggests that this is being used intentionally. So if you look at the other hand at a religious cleric just sitting in front of the camera and talking, that is not involving. If you're talking about the mother of somebody who joined ISIS, that is emotional, but it's not involving. So we're really looking here at the narrativizing of messages, the narrativizing of counter narratives and alternative narratives in that domain. Thank you very much.
Thanks to the organizers. Thanks, Marwan, for inviting me. Thanks, Marina, for making all of this happen. Thanks to my co-panelists. So before I come back to this particular image in a moment, I want to just give you a short overview of the main argument that I want to make today, and which in my view links up with what Lina has earlier this day introduced, the dialectics between presence and absence, about which I want to talk today as well. So the Islamic State did not only destroy what they called manifestations of idolatry, madahir al-shirk, as an end of itself, but rather I think the movement's strategy to attack these monuments was primarily informed by the fact that they have an eminent role for the collective identity of local communities, and understood as a fundamental precondition for the establishment of genuine Islam. The destruction of cultural properties is embedded in an all-encompassing strategy of spatial, material, and conceptual purification of the socio-religious landscape. So, by destroying cultural properties, the movement thus targets the pillars of social identities of local and transnational communities and their individual members. And I argue that this makes the Islamic State's iconoclasm rather a form of socioclasm. And visualizations of these acts are not only part of this strategy, but also furthermore help rendering the Islamic State as an effective force, as they support the production of mental images both in the minds of the movement's followers and adversaries, which these images then become testimonies to the rise of the Islamic State, its ideology and actions. But let us start with a short sequence of a movie that the Islamic State's Al-Batar Media Foundation has released in February 2017 under the title Qutaa Turuq, which could be translated to Bandits, that was released primarily to polemicize against renowned theologians that or who oppose the movement's ideology. And in the beginning sequence, to praise its own achievements, the producers chose the following kind of montage.
الدولة الإسلامية أقامت الدين في هذا الزمن، ونصرت التوحيد وهدمت الشرك، وحاربت أصناف الكفار والمرتدين، فهي تقاتل في سبيل الله وحده، وحتى تكون كلمة الله هي العليا.
So the Arabic voiceover says that, I quote, "The Islamic State established the religion in this era and granted victory to monotheism and destroyed idolatry and fought various kinds of unbelievers and apostates, and it fights on the path of the one God until God's word is the highest," which is the last part is a quotation from Surah At-Tawbah. So while this statement is among the very many reiterations of the Islamic State's ideology, what caught my attention in particular is this 6-second long sequence in the middle, that which I will play again at 25% speed in order to give you a chance to properly see it and how it is done visually. So what struck me about this imagery was the fact that the layering and object zooms employed in this montage create an effect that powerfully and paradigmatically illustrates the way in which the Islamic State conceptualizes its own position within the dialectics of Tawheed, monotheism, and Shirk, idolatry. At the same time, when on the right-hand side the minaret of an unnamed mosque collapses, which is, by the way, the Shiite mosque, the Jawad Husseiniya in Tal Afar, which was blown up in 2014, a man dressed in camouflage upholding the Islamic State's black flag rises from the ground to the very center of the image. So the message that is conveyed here is that the foundation of monotheism, which is the rightful creed or represents the good, must be built on the rubble of any manifestation of idolatry, and the new symbol replaces the old one. Also, imagery and verbal message make clear which measures the Islamic State sees fit to decide this competition between monotheism and its antipodes. The establishment of true Islam is a social revolutionary project, and it can only be achieved through a violent purification of the earth from any manifestation of monotheism's antipodes, shirk, idolatry, kufr, disbelief, and taghut, tyranny. And this is, in my view, a paradigmatic example of iconoclasm, in that it is an act of communication that does not only consist of the act of destruction itself, but rather by destroying old images, creates new ones. And these acts do therefore not aim at an annihilation of memory, but rather at creating the memory of the annihilation, as Leslie Brubaker in 2013 has argued. And moreover, as Basin Brock wrote in 1988, self-proclaimed enemies of images become the actual friends of images. In this context, since it is them who acknowledge the irresistible power of images, which arises from the fusion of the signifier and the signified. And it is only in the light of this assumption that it becomes necessary to destroy images at all. And this is what brought me to think about whether the term iconoclasm is appropriate to make sense of the manifold destructions of cultural properties perpetrated by the Islamic State. By the way, the Islamic State was and is not the only actor in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere involved in the destruction of cultural properties, of course. Rather, I believe that these deeds and the strategy pursued by the Islamic State might be better conceptualized as a form of socioclasm to fully comprehend the complexity of these actions, the manifold effects, repercussions, and dynamics. Why is this so? I think based on the Quranic dictum to command good and forbid wrong, or command right and forbid wrong, al-amr bil-ma'rufi wa-nahy anil munkar, the Islamic State has declared the intellectual and physical rejection of any material and immaterial manifestation of shirk, kufr, and taghut, its leading principle. The Islamic State directs the power of its fighters against objects that it regards as those manifestations of monotheism's antipodes. And at the same time, it targets the communities whose members' social identities are in part deeply entangled with these sides. Thereby, it targets objects which not just offer space for rituals and other practices, religious learning, and community building. More importantly, these cultural properties are valued by community members for their significance for individual and collective identities. Of course, identities are not set in stone and not fixed entities. They rather, as I would say, provide shortcuts for potentially complex systems of beliefs, normative appeals and orientations, and help people to understand who they are, how they are related to others, and how they should behave in certain situations. So what the Islamic State does is by framing, or it frames these properties as equating the other, and therefore these properties become legitimate targets, which is the case in many situations of conflict, as many of you might know. Through this process of identification of certain cultural properties with specific collectives, these sites cease to be mere physical representation of these communities, but rather become constitutional elements of a religious community and, I quote Mead here, signs of belonging in shared memory for both sides. So there's some kind of relationship or of mutual recognition established in these actions. And this is particularly important regarding attacks on pilgrimage sites, because these places are of great value for both the collective identity of religious communities and the social identities of individual believers, because the collective practices being performed in these places create a shared sense of belonging and produce, I quote Pinto here, the experience of a diffuse solidarity that transcends social and cultural differences, unquote. So they help to construct bonds and loyalties linking individual believers to their religious community. And thus they become embedded in an individual's horizons of experience, sense of the self, intellectual advancement, and personal memories, among many others. So attacking these sites, therefore, may not only annihilate certain architectural landmarks and change the spatial composition of a city or village. It not just targets the material manifestation of a certain belief system and the place of its manifold intellectual and performative expressions. Such a desecration of sacred spaces and their eventual obliteration also targets the pillars of one or more social identities, aiming to both disrupt the collective identity of a given religious community and unsettle an individual's ontological security and confidence. The term ontological security has been introduced by Clifford Geertz. In some cases, the Islamic State did not content itself with destroying the site of veneration, and the case in point is the destruction of the twin shrine in the Syrian town of Raqqa, which was an established site of pilgrimage for Shiites from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, because according to Shiite beliefs, the shrines harbored the tombs of Uwais al-Qarani and Amr ibn Yasir, both of whom were companions of the Prophet. In this case, the movement's claim for purification went even so far as to exhume the mortal remains from the tombs and remove them before its fighters would blast the gravesite. So their purification strategy was all-encompassing. By blasting the gravesite and removing the remains of the saints, the Islamic State meant not only to temporarily prevent certain social and religious practices, such as pilgrimages and saint veneration. In fact, by transferring the actual object of veneration to an unknown place, they aimed to do away once and forever with any worship related to this particular object or person at this particular place. Also, the attacks meant a blow to the social and economic infrastructure of the respective places, because pilgrimage sites more often than not provide a variety of direct and indirect income earning opportunities for the local populace, thereby helping to support schools, community centers, and much more. And furthermore, the intellectual environment built around a shrine in the form of bookshops and seminaries is at least indirectly affected, as they also depend on pilgrims' activities and the charisma of the site. To come back to the image that I showed you at the beginning of my presentation, images of these destructions are thus not merely what Zaina Masri has called, with reference to the Lebanese civil war, symbolic sites of struggle, or artifacts of ideological discourse, which ought to demonstrate the Islamic State's power and its opponents' vulnerability. Rather, the Islamic State seeks to produce what Bredekamp has called formative images, which have such a powerful and immediate effect on the targeted audiences that no one could really ignore them. So the described destructions and their mediation thus go far beyond the concept iconoclasm in their intention and effect. They must be, from my point of view, be taken as socioclasm, since the Islamic State destroys images because of their figurative representation, their religious meaning, their significance for specific communities, and the social practices evolving around them. These sites constitute vital parts of the collective identity of certain religious communities and thereby also affect aspects of the self of each individual believer. The Islamic State thus wants the destruction of cultural properties to be understood as a direct attack on the respective communities and aims at unsettling the ontological security of individuals and their intra-group bonds as well. Thank you very much.
So if I could ask all the panelists to come back for the question and answer session. We have approximately 10 minutes for discussion, questions. So I'll open it to the floor, and if you just raise your hand, hopefully I'll see you. Max.
Yeah, Raya, thank you so much. That was a spectacular presentation. I have so many questions, and I want to see more videos, but I'm struck by the resonances visually between many of the videos you showed and Cardi B's Bodak Yellow. And I'm wondering, do you see this as distinct from entirely, or part of, in certain ways, a broader historical trend of hip-hop culture drawing on like exoticized orients, thinking of like the Wu-Tang Clan, thinking of like Ghost Dog, those sorts of things? Do you see it drawn, it's sort of part of that, which is manifested most recently in Cardi B's Bodak Yellow, or is it something distinct, maybe more part of like meme culture in a general sense?
Yeah, thank you. So what I was trying to say is that it's some of both. I mean, there's obviously like, there's almost an expectation to draw from this Orientalist sounds that we've come to associate with some of those groups you just mentioned. But there's like an irony in the visual parts that makes me think that to write it off as like racist Orientalism is too easy. And I think you're right that like remix or meme culture is a big part of it. I mean, you might have recognized a lot of the videos are things that, you know, are circulated on WhatsApp, or, you know, like things that normally are used to celebrate culture or not to degrade necessarily. So like the dancing kid, right? He's funny, right? But it's usually not something that is like a minstrelsy, right? So I don't have like it's some of both. But what I was trying to do is say that there's something else happening here too. The irony is the thing that I haven't quite put my finger on. Like, because I think there is a sense of I'm playing with your expectations and I'm doing it on purpose because I don't care, you know? And that's different. It's different from like you know, I want an exotic sound in my music. Drive, effort.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
One and then two. Go ahead.
This question is also for Rhea. We've seen how in thank you. With the far right, we've seen how irony can kind of act as a preservative for extremist concepts. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about to what extent the irony of these videos and songs might act as that kind of a preservative to this variety of extremist thought, and if you think that the irreverence that's sort of inherent in this might work against that in a way that it might not necessarily for the far right.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a definitive answer. Definitely, like, part of my instinct here was that satire and parody and irony don't have to be positive or progressive, you know, uses, right? Like, thinking of that South Park musical that's just supposed to be hilarious. It's just like a disaster, right? So yeah, I can totally see it going a negative way also. But what I think I was interested in like staying with is what does this irreverence mean? You know, like, because it's not, I don't think it's pure far right stuff that's happening, but there's an ambivalence in irreverence at the same time that I was trying to find meaning in. That's not a conclusive answer, but I think it's a good reminder, right, that satire, parody, irony, these are not necessarily progressive forces of critique, right? They can also go very conservative. Yeah.
Excellent. There's one more here, and then. Okay.
Thank you all for your topics. I guess Christoph and Kareem, I want to sort of go ahead and bring you in at this point. And actually, I want to borrow from Marwan's commentary at the beginning of the conference. And the question, it seems to me both of your presentations are dealing with sort of the communicative dimensions of the IS messaging, if you will, how to sort of convey specific information in a way. Is that so? I guess the question is: do you, from your interpretation of what you're dealing with, what the images that you're looking at, do you see this functioning? Do you see them functioning primarily in a communicative, or as Marwan prefaced, affective way? Because the contrast, I think, between the two sets of material that we were looking at with this panel, in terms of Raya's selection of material, which seems to me very affective in its composition and its aims. The information that's conveyed is derogative at best and obscure, ultimately, it seems to me. Whereas the other set of imagery is somewhat less fashioned, though you talk about the aesthetic of that particularly striking image with the tawhid, the reference to tawhid. So this is, if you can elaborate on this dialectic, I suppose. I would be very interested to hear that.
Yeah, definitely. Visuals are very prevalent in Daesh's media campaign, and it is definitely performing a communicative act that is involving affect and conveying information as well. But as Marwan said earlier, information is not the only thing. One of the interesting things about the images being a communicative act is the use of photo captions, how you enforce that rigid dichotomy between us and them. In that sense, it's going to be here mujahideen, martyrs, soldiers of the caliphate, vis-a-vis the apostates, the Rafidis, a derogatory term for Shias, you name it. So the communicative act is here being performed both by the image and its visual semiotics and its visual framing at the broader level, and also at the textual complementation of those images through the photo captions.
I can only agree. I mean, the theory is looking at the effective power of images. You've outlined the most important works. I mean, but I wouldn't so strictly distinguish between communication and affect. I think both are interconnected and interdigitated in this kind of communication. And I think images can also transcend language borders, so making the producers able to reach a far more broader audience than the language employed in the videos might indicate at first sight. So I think basically it's both, and they have an effective potential that not only targets supporters but also the adversaries and opponents. And people who will then appropriate this material and do with it whatever they want.
I think we have time for one more question.
I have a question for you, Christoph, actually, based on this. I was wondering when you were talking, like, what do you see is the difference between a socioclasm and a kind of a performance or a representation of sociocide? I mean, are they, are they connected? Is it or is this just like a ridiculous play on words?
To be really honest, I would have to think about more about this question. So I couldn't come up with a good answer right now. So we'll talk about it later.
I guess on that note we end, and there's coffee and
Yes,
things.
we have a 15-minute break. Jamal, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.